Hello there and welcome back to the channel. This is Nerd.World History, and today I'm doing what is, I think, the final major tribe from southern Britannia before the Roman conquest of 43 AD, whose name is bloody unpronounceable to me. And I'm going to mostly call them the Regni in this video because that's an abbreviated version, but it's the Regnenses, I think. Cannot pronounce it. It basically means people of the kingdom. Interestingly, I'll get to it in a minute, the name itself, no one knows where it came from. It's only Romans that ever reference it, and anyway, before we get started on that, please like, share, subscribe, comment down below, and check out the playlist that's probably linked up in the corner. And you'll find a full playlist of other Celtic tribes. If you're watching just as this video has been uploaded, there's a load more than been made before it. If you're watching this at some point in the future, after I've finished this series, there's a load more been made after this one. So check out those as well. And with that said, let's get into the story of the Regnenses tribe. The Regnenses occupied an area of territory bordered by the Canti and the Atrebates primarily, as well as the Belgi. They were on the southeastern coastline of Britannia. They were also noted for building a considerable number of hill forts and were quite, in some ways, quite militarized. This may also have been a reflection of the fact that the Catavaloni tribe was expanding fiercely throughout that area, and they may have been defending up, but as I've mentioned in previous videos, if you're not familiar, the term hill fort is very misleading. A hill fort, in not every instance, is a military installation. Some of them are, and some of them have other functions that are completely non-military, and the ramparts and embankments are nothing but show. They're a status symbol. Others actually are fortifications and would have had a strong military function. Others were somewhere in the middle. The reality is, we don't know. Is the brutal honest truth. We don't know. But they built a lot of them, and many of them did have at least something of a military function. Their capital was a settlement named by the Romans called Noviomagus. Noviomagus is actually a name that the Romans used throughout the Roman Empire, and it actually is a Latinization of Celtic words novio and magus, which mean new and market. According to my research, I'm not a linguist, but I believe that's what they mean. What this settlement would have been called before the Romans turned up, we're not sure, because the Romans seem to be more likely the ones who named it. There was a settlement there before the Romans turned up, and it was the capital, at least for a time, possibly, of the Atrebates, which I'll explain in a moment. The actual tribe, the Regnenses themselves, the Regni, were most likely a domestic tribal kingdom to Britannia. In other words, unlike the Atrebates or the Belgi or the Parisi, they didn't originate on the continent like a tribe like the Silures did or someone like that. They didn't come from elsewhere and most likely settle into Britannia and intermingle. Certainly some of them would have done, but the Celtic identity, the tribal identity rather, of the Regni was a domestic tribe. They were likely some form of confederacy of smaller units that banded together to become one bigger one for mutual defence. There was a period in their history where it is possible that the Atrebates held a considerable amount of sway over them, putting pressure on, if not directly ruling them, a bit like a sort of overlord state. But with threats from the Catavaloni coming from the north, the Atrebates were not really in a position to enforce that. Now, I did a video previously on a character called Epilus. He was an Atrebatian leader who ended up being exiled, and he ended up in the territory of the Canti. The Canti on the other side of the Regnenses, and he would have had to travel through their territory. Now, if he was an enemy leader traveling with his nobles, he probably would have been captured and sent back. There's plenty of archaeological indicators, as well as coinage and such things, as well as maybe even a few Roman references here and there, basically, he probably did that with forces he picked up from both the Atrebates and the Regnenses when he invaded, and then overthrew whatever local leadership of the Canti and took over. The Regnenses basically didn't oppose him for whatever reason. They also, a great deal of coinage turns up in their territory that originates from the Cadavolani, the Dabuni, the Atrebates, and others, as well as various Gaulish tribes and even later Roman coinage, which turns up in their territory quite routinely, meaning they had extensive trade. They were also known to be exporters of things like hunting dogs, military equipment, swords, things of that nature, shields, waterproof coats. Interesting thing, side note, one of the biggest exports from Britannia in the pre-Roman and during the Roman period were waterproof coats, and they did it using urine. May have to do a video on that one day. It's kind of interesting, but only a side note. Anyway, they were big exporters and also big importers of luxury and fine goods, silks and cottons and other materials they would have liked to import. It meant that they had a level of sophistication sometimes that only tribes similar to themselves, like the Canti, the Atrebates, who had good continental connections both in the pre-Roman and post-Roman era before the conquest of the Claudian conquest in 43 AD. I apologise, I've a bit of a dry throat there. If my voice sounds a little weird today. The tribe had good trade links before this. They were annexed by the Romans in 43 AD pretty swiftly, putting up little to no resistance to the Romans. This could be an indicator of either a panicked set of nobles who simply surrendered. It could have been that they were already, and this is more likely in my opinion, it's not based on anything written down or any historical note. This is just my opinion based on just how quickly the Romans steamrolled through their territory and how little account there is of any major resistance from them. The Romans have been sweetening the pot with this tribe for quite a while, a bit like they've been doing with the Atrebates and the Trinovantes. It's likely, although unlike the Atrebates, these people invited the Romans in, they were probably expecting it and simply became a Roman state. It is notable that after the Romans came, though, any Atrebates influence over the Regnenses was taken away, and the individual kingdom of the Regni became its own client state of the Romans with completely separate identity. Now again, how exactly the Atrebates held any sway over the Regni is a little fuzzy. Interpretation would say that they didn't directly rule them, but probably had economic or military pressure on them, probably being a stronger, wealthier kingdom with better connections. It probably meant they were able to control over them. It also is possible that previous leaders of the Atrebates, when they first came to Britannia, remember the Atrebates were a continental Celtic tribe which came from Gaul into Britain, they probably annexed the area in or around where the Regnenses lived. And the Regnenses were very sporadic and spread out. And again, calling a hill fort a fort is misleading, so that doesn't mean that these were particularly necessarily a highly militarized people when the Atrebates turned up. Because when the Atrebates turned up is also a little fuzzy. It was maybe around 100 BC. But there's no conclusive thing of that. It's hard to say, like anything, because they didn't write anything down. So you're basing it all on archaeological evidence. Remember that you effectively are replacing just... It's like having one set of rulers simply replaced by another. There's a continuity of people in an area. But the Regnenses may have been a displaced people who lived where the Atrebates ended up living, or they may have simply been where they were, but the Atrebates initially held some kind of pressure on them, and then settled more to the west. It's not clear. And I'll be honest, I had to do a bit of research on this because I wasn't sure. This is one of the tribes that I'm not as familiar with as I am with many of the other tribes like the Cadavolani and the Atrebates, so I can ream this stuff off memory. I'm not as familiar with them, so I had to do a bit more research, and I couldn't find anything categorical that said the Atrebates ruled this tribe, and when the Romans came, the Romans had to boot the Atrebates out, and there's nothing I can find like that. But the tribe itself did seem to have a great deal of good continental connections, and those connections probably saved the tribe in many ways during the Roman invasion. It probably saved a lot of lives, because as much as it probably would have been better for all the tribes to put up a united front against the Romans, the man stood a chance of winning. In reality, they probably wouldn't have done against it. Was like, that's like anyone else now going up against the superpower on your own. It's just not going to happen. And to the Romans, actually, Afghanistan is a really good analogy. I remember a historian, and I want to say it was Neil Francis, compared the Roman invasion of Britain to the invasion of Afghanistan by Allied forces a number of years ago. And it was, in many ways, the Druids in particular, who I will do a more extensive video on, are a very good analogy for Al-Qaeda from a Roman point of view. And I should stress, before anyone's typing away, from a Roman point of view. Not from ours or anyone else's, but from a Roman sort of view of it. The Druids were the ones organising resistance against them. It was the Druids who got all the tribes to work together to fight them. It was the Druids that got all these different Celtic tribes in Britain to send forces into Gaul to reinforce them. And it was often the Druids who people dealt with, like basically other powers. When British mercenaries were hired, such as by Carthage. Carthage was known to have hired British mercenaries to fight in its wars against the Romans centuries earlier. It's likely you dealt with the Druids when you're doing things like that. I say likely, not necessarily 100%. Again, with nothing being wrote down, it's hard to say, but my guess would be you deal with the centralized authority, and they're the closest thing to a central authority the Celtic world had. And the Romans needed to destroy that in order to destroy the Celtic identity, and then basically stamp a Roman seal on the Celtic world. Anyway, to get back to the Regnenses, because of their good connections to the continent, probably with Rome as well, and with the Roman army, in all probability, with them trading slaves, weapons, hunting dogs, and other things onto the continent, the Romans probably spared them any serious oppression. There's no evidence of any really harsh treatment by the Romans after their invasion. And they were also not part of Boudicca's revolt either, so they didn't suffer any particularly negative consequences of that during the later days of the invasion. But again, it's probably the Romans sweetening it up, because they will have been not only trading with them, they'll have been educating them. It's also notable that I will do a dedicated video on this, because he's a man who's definitely worth mentioning. He'll get mentioned in this, but I'm going to do a bigger breakdown on him. And he's a man called Cobby Dubnus, or possibly Tobby Dubnus. There's a debate. You see, I thought they were two separate individuals, personally. But I know there's a debate where some people argue that perhaps Cobby Dubnus and Tobby Dubnus are actually the same person. So I'll get into that when I do a bigger breakdown. But Cobby Dubnus, he was the leader here in this area. He was an Atrebates leader, but he may have ruled Atrebatean territory from the Regnenses capital at one point. It's a bigger story that I will do as a dedicated video. But basically, that's this tribe in a nutshell. Good continental connections as well as good domestic connections. May have been quite militarized and actually quite an advanced culture with access to decent technology and resources, but because they didn't oppose the Romans, they were fully absorbed and Romanized into the empire quite efficiently early on in the invasion. So, with that said, I really need a new chair. There we go. It made no difference. If you made it all the way to the end of this video, please like, share, subscribe, discuss in the comments below about this tribe. And I get a lot of requests for tribes. Note that I am getting to every tribe eventually. I will be getting to them. I'm getting to this one now, and I've got a list of the ones I'm doing next. I will get to them. We're actually about 3/4 of the way through now. So we're getting there. But if you made it all within this video, thank you for watching, and bye-bye.